All right, I think we're going to get started. People are starting to trickle in here, but I have a few things to chat about before Kenton takes the stage. So, hello everyone. My name is Sarah, and I'm a customer growth specialist with NAIT's Department of Continuing Education. I want to welcome you to this evening's community engagement session, Designing Your Sustainable Home and Lifestyle. We're really excited about what Kenton's going to talk to you about tonight. But before we begin, I want to take care of just a few housekeeping items. So you know, we've turned off all attendee videos and microphones for the duration of the session. And if you have questions during the presentation, feel free to pop them in the chat box. You should have a little chat bubble icon that will allow you to message Kenton or myself. So feel free to pop stuff in there and we'll take care of that at the end of Kenton's presentation. These sessions are being recorded for archiving and playback. They will be made available at a later date. And at the end of tonight's session, you'll have an opportunity to participate in a short survey. I'd encourage you to do so. We'd really love to hear what you have to say about what you see tonight. And again, for details about upcoming webinars, we do have them planned throughout the spring, and now it's almost summer. So make sure you check nait.ca/engagement sessions to see what's coming up next. And without further ado, I want to welcome our speaker tonight, Kenton. He is a teacher, a designer, a consultant for the sustainable living and the tiny house movement. He's trained as a government teacher and an internationally certified permaculture instructor. Kenton teaches others how to create community, grow food, and build homes. He's designed multiple properties. He started a permaculture school in Barbados, and he's been a guest speaker for conferences, universities, and governments. Kenton lives in an off-grid tiny house in Alberta that he designed and built himself, and he continues to run workshops globally. So you could find out more about that on his website and also on the NAIT website. We've got a permaculture class coming soon that we're pretty stoked about. So without further ado, I am going to pass the reins off to Kenton. Kenton, welcome. We're so excited to have you tonight.
Ah, there we go, unmuted. Well, thank you, Sarah, for the warm introduction. And hello, everyone. I'm very excited to be here with you tonight. I specialize in in-person education. I do a lot of hands-on workshops and skill building workshops, teach people design skills and stuff like rainwater harvesting, composting, food forestry, and gardening. However, I understand in our current times, us being together is not an option at this exact moment in time. And part of the reason I'm actually really excited is I've held off for so long doing courses online like this. And as you can see in the weatherman effect we've got going on here, I like taking the things I do very seriously. So tonight you are getting a glimpse of the course that I have partnered up with NAIT to do. And yes, I've got my full green screen operation and filming studio here all set up for that course. And this is a 45-minute segment of that course. So thank you all for your time in being here. I hope you enjoy this following presentation. I'll say one more thing before I start jumping in, and that is I'm used to seeing the whites of people's eyes, seeing them smile, get them excited, have that back and forth. While we can't have some of that as much other than the Q&A at the end, there is a way still to engage with the session in terms of the thumbs up and the clapping. There's some emotes and feel free in the question section to throw in your comments to engage maybe even each other. If you're kind of seeing each other's comments in there, it kind of adds an extra personal element instead of this being so one way. But otherwise, I'm standing over here by my green screen and I can't get close to the computer. So I will look at your comments and questions and we'll answer all of those at the end. Okay, so welcome. Making a sustainable home and lifestyle. This presentation has been divided up into 3 parts. First, I'm going to tell you a little bit, thank you for the high five, tell you a little bit about my story and how I got to be in front of you here today. Who am I and what kind of experiences I've gone through to get here. And then 2, I want to give you an insight into the basics of sustainable design. Now, as Sarah mentioned, my background is first as a teacher and then as a permaculture designer and certified teacher. So I'm going to be giving you a basic approach to sustainable design from that permaculture angle, and I'm going to do my best as I can in this short period of time to give you the basics of that. You'll see how that applies to your gardens. It can apply to your home, and even beyond. As Sarah mentioned, I also kind of like to be involved at the community level, and there's major reasons for that. At the end of the day, I always say you can do anything, but you can't do everything. So I'm going to teach you a lot of things tonight, but at the end of it, don't feel like you have to take it all on. There's a reason why we have people like electricians to help us install solar, and experts in water, and people who are arborists and our nursery people. Do not feel like you are alone in trying to create a sustainable home and lifestyle. I think that happens a lot when people try to go off grid and try to make their own, cozy spot away from it all, as they end up sequestering themselves and being disconnected in that way. While it may work for some people, at the end of it puts a lot of onerous task on us to know a lot and have a lot of skills. I like to emphasize that a lot of this information you can take and own and dive deeper. And there's also something to be said of saying you're becoming a specialist in one area of this content, and you choose to work with others and form community and connect and integrate with others. The same way I'm going to be teaching you how to integrate your home with your landscape and your landscape with the other elements within it. The last part of the presentation will be our getting a little extra more content. As I said, it's only 45 minutes, short time to spend together, and a Q&A session. And I love your question and answers. So please, 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 if you have something you want to ask, be sure to, don't forget it, write it down, put it in the chat box, and otherwise we can take live questions at the end. So my story, how did I get to be here today? I started my career at the University of Alberta. I got my education there and becoming a teacher. And I was like many other teachers in terms of them being all like, hoo-ha, let's train the next generation and have that feel-good feeling and do this job of purpose. And as soon as I got to the education system, I started to question, why are we teaching what we're teaching to kids? And fundamentally, what's the point of our education system? Because in a way, it seems to have been built as a hurdle to get a living, instead of preparing us to make a life. And so I, as a teacher, was passionate about education, but I quickly fell out of love with the curriculum, the content I was told to teach. And I had to start looking for something else to teach. The first thing I came across was a master composter recycler program with the city of Edmonton. And that was an amazing program, and you can actually apply to be a part of that program still to this day. It was a stepping stone for me. And what I'll say about it is it's fantastic for teaching you some of those basic skills around recycling and composting. And I'm an avid composter to this day. In fact, I'm teaching 5 different kinds of composting in the NAIT course coming up. And I've run numerous workshops on vermicomposting and other kinds of composting for people who want to really dive deep into it. So I still carry a lot of what I learned in that time with the Master Composter Recycler program. However, I had a beef, so to say, with still looking for something more, in the sense that I was learning how to reduce my negative impact, recycle, and recycle organic material. And while that's good and important knowledge to have, it was not knowledge at how to have a positive impact, just reduce my negative impact. So I had to keep looking. This was, as I said, a stepping stone. And the next stepping stone that I came to was encountering permaculture. Now, for those who aren't familiar with what permaculture is, we'll dive a little deeper into it in the course, because the basics I'm going to teach you are essentially what we'll be teaching in a permaculture course. But if you're looking for a definition, I like saying it's a design science for designing humans back into their physical and social landscape. How do we harmoniously integrate our homes? How do we create food systems that are abundant and self-renewing? How do we ensure that we're increasing soil and biodiversity? Because if we're not, if we're decreasing biodiversity, if we're decreasing soil, there's a name for that, and it's called a parasite. We are destroying the ecosystem which hosts us. And that's not something I think anyone wants to carry. When it comes down to facing the music, we have to ensure through intelligent design that we are having a positive impact, not just reducing our negative. So that 2-week course changed my life. It was exactly the content I was looking for. I've taught this course numerous times now around the world. And indeed, the course that I'm teaching at NAIT is actually a part of it. And there is room for us to develop a program for giving people certifications in permaculture. And that's up and coming. So I took that 2-week course and I took it back to the high school system that I was still within. I started a high school club. The kids friggin' loved it. I loved it. But I was doing it for 40 minutes a week. I thought, is this all the impact I can have? So when my contract finished, I decided to go to the home of where permaculture really began as a movement, Australia. I went there for a full year. I went and did an internship with a man named Jeff Lawton, and then traveled around the country because there was so much diversity and interest in permaculture and sustainable living there. They've had to face a lot of challenges in terms of water, in terms of being their own isolated continent. There's a lot of off-gridders and permaculture enthusiasts there. So I wandered around the country for a year after my internship, seeing how different people had set up their food systems, their home systems, their community systems, and learned. Now that was, in my opinion, that was like life university. This is the content now, and learning from all these relative experts in the industry, exactly what I needed for my own personal life, and so I could pass it on to others as an educator. So then I came back home. And you might think, okay, so I'm gonna, start teaching now, right? And maybe open up my own independent business or go back to the school system. But subtropical Australia is just a little bit different from temperate climate Canada. So while a lot of what I learned, the principles, the design process, even numerous techniques, all of it still was useful. The specifics around exact home needs, how to handle water, soil, plant assemblies, it all changed. So I decided to go across Canada for a year and repeat the learning process. And I did this a lot, by the way, through a network called the Woofing Network. It stands for Willing Workers on Organic Farms. And if you have the ability to up and go and be a bit of a traveler, it is a fantastic way for to travel very cheap and go learn from people in the field who are living this kind of content and knowledge. These are farmers, these are leaders of communities, these are builders of homes, or people who are building their own homes, and they're more than welcoming people to come and help them manage your systems and learn from, but you do a work exchange. So that's how I managed to travel for so cheap, by the way, for 2 years, using a lot of that network to learn and network. Now you might think, okay, so now I come back home. I'm ready to start my business. I'm ready to teach people all that I've learned and mesh together the knowledge and skills that I had with the training I had as a teacher. But a job opportunity came across my lap, and Sarah did mention it. It was to start a school for permaculture in Barbados. I know, twist my arm. I guess I'll go. It was a pretty amazing project. They had land from the government was willing to donate us, a team of local experts and local people who were willing to help organize the movement. We wrote a grant and got $75,000 in UN funding. And before you knew it, I was on a plane and down there training people. We worked with the government and ended up training people in the Ministry of Agriculture in permaculture so they could start reinvigorating their agricultural sector and making it more sustainable. And we actually trained over 100 participants from the community, many of which the government sponsored to be there. Young adults who wanted to get into agriculture. This is truly a heartwarming and phenomenal project. And occasionally I still go down there. I haven't been down there for a short while now because they had switch-ups in government, but what a fantastic place to take on permaculture in that way. Now I'm going to share with you a few projects in a short second, how we're doing permaculture here, because we do have sites and we do have a bit of a movement as well in Alberta and across Canada. So after all that in Barbados, I finally came back home to Edmonton, started up my business and started creating edible communities, consulting with individuals who wanted to kickstart their properties and have coaching and training. And indeed, I designed and built my own off-grid tiny house. And that is a whole thing that I'm known for teaching now across North America. But I always tell people it's my sneaky way of teaching permaculture is call it a tiny house workshop, and I end up teaching about their climate and about how their utility systems work and how to make a home. And I always say I'm sneaking permaculture in like we put zucchini in chocolate cake. So they come for the tiny homes and they leave with a whole lot more. So as I said, my whole thing is around designing humans back into their physical and social environment, giving people those knowledge and skills for food, homes, and community. And that's what really drives me, is to be a catalytic impact, have a catalytic impact in helping us as a species, I guess. We have so much to learn, and I think this is a great vehicle, is looking at our homes and our gardens and going, well, what do I want out of these things? And indeed making them so much more than just even sustainable. All right, so now a little bit about me. I'll share with you a few projects, a few little ways you can engage more, and we'll talk about the online courses and whatnot a little more at the end as well. In terms of some of the work and what you can be doing on a property, it can of course range from everything from setting up your own DIY rain barrel or garden to having an excavator on site. And this was a client in Australia where we built a 2-acre food forest. That's a perennial food-based system we'll talk a little more about later on. And a part of that was doing earthworks and making the property drought-proof, doing slight earthworks where you make these berms, so to say. They're actually called a swale, is the correct permaculture name for it, that holds water higher up on the landscape so it doesn't run off in a rain event. And the owner of this property now has more food than he knows what to do with. He's got 282 fruit trees of 80 different varieties, a market-sized garden, and I believe 20,000 liters of rainwater storage underneath his deck. So in the times that they have had in terms of fires and drought, he has a water and food secure property. Now that's not most people's scale. Most people's scale is a little more something in their own backyard in terms of growing garden beds. This is actually a site here in Edmonton. This is at Waldorf School. This was done in the last year. We actually had a few sponsors and built a lot of this with students in the workshop. Otherwise, I built it with the community. And this is, as you can see, a bunch of garden beds, and that's called the herb spiral that you see in the middle. And here we are just finishing up the completion of the herb spiral and building a patio around it. And here's a good example of, again, just the different scales and numbers of clients. You look back to this, and this is quite costly. It's well worth the money to invest into your property to make it drought-proof, water secure, and food secure. But that's a lot of design time and installation time and cost, and bring an excavator on site and whatnot. This is, again, still serious enough in that a lot of people would kind of consider this quite a hefty project to, do some masonry in terms of putting all the herb spiral together and a patio and a raised garden beds and filling them with all that soil. But we can dumb it down to wherever you're at. I always say, use what you have and do what you can. And so this is a client that had recycled metal bins, and we backfilled them, mulched the area around it, and planted it out. And here you can see it's just an oasis of food, and it's right next to the house. So wherever people are at, I've been helping clients at numerous levels depending on their budgets. My true passion, though, a lot of it comes through, yes, of course, the education side, but doing public projects, doing community projects where it's not in one person's backyard, and instead it's a space that everyone gets to go to and share. And there's now 6 of these in Alberta that I've worked on. One exciting one for you to check out is the St. Albert Food Forest. If you know where the grain elevators are in St. Albert or the Meadowview Ball Diamonds, it's right in between those two. It's on this hillside. I did a design for the site, and then we installed it with the community. It's an entirely edible public space on city land, which, again, these things just don't get talked about enough, because that is something to celebrate. That's amazing that right now you can go there and you can participate, enjoy it, sit, relax. You can help do some of the weeding if you wish, but you can also take the food. If there's food on the trees, it is everyone's food. So there's lots of projects like that. Here's another one, Brander Garden School. Did this one a couple summers ago. It had a huge area that was a problem in terms of being a bunch of mud and hard compacted ground and broken asphalt. And what we did is made up a design for basically a mini orchard system and gardenings. So did a design up, and then we installed it. This is the part that's the most exciting, that really brings joy to my heart, is that this was done by the community. in a single day. 80 people showed up. I led my fellow students, previous people who had graduated from some of my workshops, and they came out to volunteer, and they were team captains. We had some donors and sponsors and some organizers from within the school. And at the end of it all, as you can kind of see here in the picture, we got 50 feet of raised beds, 200 linear feet of fruit trees and shrubs, and 100 linear feet of raspberries. A beautiful and wonderful space for these kids to learn in and enjoy, and get an education about food. And doing, of course, the education stuff is the last part of kind of what I offer and do. And whether it's hands-on stuff, this is a rainwater harvesting system we built in St. Albert. That's actually on a heritage building. I can't believe they let us do that. And there's another workshop where I taught in Toronto, a tiny house workshop. But as I mentioned, I'm super excited to be offering courses now with NAIT. And this is one that's coming up this fall in September, in the Permaculture Core program. That one's really geared around professional development and making people understand how to become a permaculture designer. And of course, this teaser, which is a portion of the upcoming course, the Sustainable Home and Property course, which I'll give you some more details at the end of the talk. Whew. Okay, so you know a little more about me now. You understand a little more of my biases and where I come from. That's always, I think, an important thing for you to understand. And some of the projects, you kind of got some ideas now on the ground what some of this could look like. But by no means does it have to look like anything you just saw. You get to take the basics I'm about to teach you and apply it to whatever your goals are. What are our goals? Let's talk about this. I think, and I've said this numerous times already, that we have to ask ourselves, how do we design ourselves back within our physical and social landscape? And the basics that I'm going to teach you are geared towards that. How do we get a house that actually meets our needs, that actually houses us? How do we create landscapes that abundantly feed us and produce? And in part of that, in addition to that, is that communities that thrive. What I said earlier about you can't do everything, well, there's no point in you trying to produce every kind of food that you could possibly eat. But if you produce a certain type of food and your neighbor produces some other kind of food, you don't both have to. And I think that is the essence of what community is supposed to be about. I actually think that we're in a strange time, of course. But before this whole situation unfolded, I still think that we were incredibly lonely. I don't think ever before have communities of people been so lonely and yet been so dense. And I think that comes down to how we functionally connect to each other. What is our basic purpose to each other? And if it's just monetary and being specialists, we don't actually feel that well connected. But when we're generalists and we assist each other in different ways, and we actually have that transaction of function, of purpose, that's where we feel fulfilled. That's where we feel connected and grounded, not just to each other, but to the landscape itself that we're on. So I think that's our task, and the basics that I'm going to be teaching you is going to be geared towards helping you with that. A little bit more on terminology too. I think it's important that we emphasize cooperation. That when we think about ourselves with our landscape and each other, but particularly our landscape, we always seem to separate ourselves. We say, oh, I want to live, on the land maybe. And that's would be someone who's being more radical maybe and trying to homestead, or live on the land, or live off the land. But that terminology implies separation. And that's important, I think, for us to dissect, because it is living with our local landscape. Only in abundance do we remain if we support what supports us. Okay, enough talk of that. Let's get down to the basics now. The three basics I'm going to teach you today, and they're going to be able to be applied to your home and to your landscapes and gardens. The first is called sectors. It is the natural flows of energy that will be hitting your house, hitting your garden, and hitting your landscape. And you only have two options here. Work with it or work against it. And most people are ignorant of those flows of energy. They actually are unaware how the sun moves across the sky, for example, and how to then accept or reject that sunlight for the heating of their home or the optimization of their garden. So in ignorance, we'll often work against it, and that is a problem in design because nature always wins. Working against nature is always going to be work. And I don't know about you, but I'd rather design the work out. So if we honor these flows of energy, we study them, and we make our relative design decisions around, say, for example, placement of windows, or the size of our awnings, or the use of shutters, or the placement of our trees. All of those things I just listed will affect your heating and cooling bills. But you can only use them intelligently if you know where the sun is moving at different times of the year, because it has a certain path, and that path is constantly changing. Don't worry. I'm going to show you some pictures to emphasize this and make this point clear. But I like using the sun as the quick example that we obviously have to work with the sun. The second thing I'm going to teach you for basics is how to optimize around humans. And the word we have for this is zones. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean, there's a functionality, a ergonomics, so to say, of human input and use. And we often don't consider it, but the example I can give you, which you can relate to, or most people can, is intelligent kitchen design. In a good kitchen, there's supposed to be this triangle of space, and an equal distance, thus makes the triangle, of a sink, an oven, and a fridge. Because you're going to be constantly moving between those three. And if you have them a fairly equal distance apart and well situated to each other, your movements in the kitchen feel more harmonious, and you are less exhausted at the end of cooking a meal. Now, that makes sense to most people who've worked in a kitchen, which I think most of us have. Hopefully we have. But why aren't we taking that same wisdom and applying that to the rest of our house? Or, as I'm going to show you, to our landscapes. So zones is the second thing I'm going to teach you. The last thing I'm going to jump into, and this is where a lot of the magic and the techniques of permaculture really shines, is in connectivity, in relationships between things that we put together. And I'll have to explain that more as we come to it, because it's going to be a little mind-blowing, and it's endless in its opportunity, because as designers, we can always be better about putting things together for beneficial relationships. All right, let's jump into the first. Let's talk about sectors. The first thing I want to teach you about is a little bit of the sun, then the wind, and water. These are the big three. There are still others, such as fire, wildlife, noise, and actually humans as well. They're their own sector of moving through a property. And we're not going to jump into the other ones, but the big three are the ones you really have to kind of be grounded in when you're starting to look at your home design and your landscape design around your house, and the relative placement of things like your garden and other edibles. Let's talk about the sun first. I mentioned those angles. Here is a fairly good illustration that shows the relative angles for Edmonton, Alberta. It's not quite bang on, but it's close. And what you'll notice here is that indeed the sun creates our seasons. We know this, but we often don't understand just how so that sun moves across the sky and the number of hours it does so. So you can see in that one side, the low angle down there, that is called the winter solstice. And you know it from how many hours of darkness we have at the shortest day of the year, December 21st. And obviously that creates the coldest time of the year. The equinox is a very important time. That's the next ring. And that is September and March 21st. And that sun rises due east and sets due west. It does not go overhead. It comes for us, because we're in the northern half of the hemisphere of the Earth. Because we're in the northern hemisphere, the sun comes predominantly from the south. You can see that in that angle. It goes up in there. And that is very important, because around March and September 21st, around the time we really want to start cluing in and optimizing around this sun. September 21st, in terms of, hey, how far can we extend our growing season? And you can actually design around those sun angles for optimization with, say, a greenhouse or a modification of a greenhouse called a cold frame. Also, the relative location of things that might block that sunlight from coming in to your house in the morning and the evening, because at September 21st, it's already starting to get chilly. And you might as well have that sunlight hitting your house and entering your windows. The last angle that you see is the summer solstice, June 21st. And at that time of the year, everything is abundant in the landscape because there is so much sun as long as there's water around to support it. However, when it comes to our gardens, many things in our gardens do not like this much sunlight, and they need some consideration for some shade. They do not want the hot western sun hitting them, other than a few things, of course, like our tomatoes, which just soak it up. But the other part we're not thinking about here is our homes. That those angles, how high that sun gets in the up in the sky, and then where it rises and sets to, is very important when we start doing landscaping around a house to have shade cast onto the house instead of hot sunlight warming up our walls and entering deeper into our house and entering our windows. Here is an example of what I'm talking about. And here you can see the use of, yes, solar panels, pretty obvious, which they're facing south. Yes, that's probably optimal for their solar gain. And by the way, if you have solar panels that can adjust, you can optimize for those angles for the sun being in the sky, higher or lower. By the way, for our winter, if you can adjust, like an 80-degree angle gets you optimal sunlight. But as the sun is higher in the sky into the summer, it's nice to drop your panels down. Most people don't want to fiddle with that, and they'll just mount it straight on, and they'll have a middle angle to kind of get the best of both seasons. So yes, there's solar panels. You see the garden beds, but the other one you might be thinking about there is the hedge. The hedge is actually taking sunlight, which otherwise could be heating that brick wall, and is turning it into, instead, foliage. It's turning it into that plant, and that plant could be even a food hedge. A veg, and it could be heating, not just helping with the cooling of the house, but producing food. There's a great saying in permaculture that there is no problems, only solutions. As soon as we have a problem that is a human sentiment, that is a lost opportunity for us to look at something in a different light. Wind. Now, predominantly across Canada, we have a cold northwest wind. And you have to stick your finger up in the air to determine what your local site is. But from the north, the west, and the northwest, it blows over the mountains and comes down across the majority of Canada. That's important. And that's important for placement, say, for example, of trees. If you place coniferous trees on the northwestern side of your house, as they're the needle-bearing trees, you now have a wind barrier which blocks the cold winds from robbing the heat from your house. You wouldn't stand outside without a coat on, something to break the wind in the wintertime. Why do we expect our houses to do the same? Most people do not give this much consideration, but there are some who do. And those who live in the countryside know that the wind is a force to be reckoned with, not just for our homes, but actually literally blow things away in your yard. Many farmers will use windbreaks. You see them on the edge of fields to reduce erosion and loss of topsoil, but you will also see them around their homes. This is a fantastic example of a shelter belt. And this one's quite complex in the sense that it has multi-tiers, so you don't get a wind dumping effect when it comes over and more erosion, but also in the sense that it has these different species, and you can use different species strategically. Permaculture is all about stacking functions, looking at the relative outputs of one element or another and placing it next to another for benefits. So in this example, maybe the outer row is a very hardy species. Maybe it's a sea buckthorn, or maybe it's a lilac. These are both pretty hardy, and they could be on the outside of that hedge and take the brunt of the wind. And then behind that, you could put a species which is still hardy, because you're still going to have some wind coming through that bush, and over top it, maybe you're going to put another species that's going to be fairly durable. And then behind that, you could maybe put a fruit-bearing tree. And you see what I'm saying here? We can actually start putting the species relative to what sector is hitting them, based on not just breaking the wind, but adding extra functions on, like, say, for food. So if we had a row of apple trees, or a row of Saskatoons, or maybe a final row of Hascat berries down low. And so now you have a shelter belt which also produces food. And in this case, an example, he's got his shelter belt designed so that they can actually get a tractor in between the rows, and he's doing alley cropping. So now we have agriculture, and we have forestry, agroforestry, and we have a shelter belt. The opportunities are endless. But anyways, I'm getting a little offhand here talking about relationships, but understanding the wind is important not just for reducing the cooling on our heating on our houses in the wintertime, but also can be used optimally for cooling us in the summertime. It would also take the stress off of our gardens and our landscapes if we break that wind. Often when you're gardening, you're trying to live within your climate, right? We have our different ratings for what you can grow. But what's interesting about that is once you understand the relative needs of your plants and how to be a microclimate designer, you can push your relative growing area. You could grow things which you normally could not grow in this area because you have sheltered them, because you have reduced, say, for example, the wind, or you've put extra thermal mass around them to buffer, say, a frost. There's lots of ways to make microclimates, and the wind is one thing we have to consider. The last is water, and there are many techniques that can teach you around using water. The thing that we need to bear in mind is we need to start looking at water as an opportunity, not a pest. Most people treat water as a pest. You know, it goes off of our roofs, it goes down our concrete, it gets into our foundations and goes into our sub pumps. And we push it all away, and make our landscapes shed water. Now, obviously, for infrastructural considerations, that not always a bad thing. When we think about our biology, it is not always a good thing. We think about the potential of using that water, of storing it, and then using it, rather than having it come from the tap. We really should reanalyze how we have our water move through our yards and our properties. So a good call to action. And I teach a lot about this in terms of the techniques and ways you can approach using water in your landscape. I teach about this through numerous courses, but as an insight into it, look towards the highest point on your landscape. And from there, slow it, store it, and soak it. There are numerous techniques for all three of those tasks at hand, and you can put water to work because water is powerful. It has kinetic potential. It has thermal mass potential. It has potential to be turned into anything that is alive. And we know this when we start gardening, we have to water a lot. It does not make sense to be using chlorinated, fluorinated water out of the tap that we're paying for when free stuff came from the sky and we paid to get rid of it. So how do we start doing that? Well, not all of us have a large landscape. That first image that you see here, that's actually showing elevation. Once you know your contour lines, this is you can see that map below of representing that three-dimensional hill or mountain. And you've seen these from when you go hiking and you look at topographical maps. Those are just showing the elevation changes as you go up. And what's important about that is once you know those on a property, whether you use simple techniques such as something called an A-frame, or you hire someone to help survey, or you even get a drone that can shoot down and get very accurate contour mapping of your property. Once you do that, you can do something like this. And in this image that you see here, you have a high up property or high up dam or pond. That is gravity water, which now can be used for irrigation, for fire, for any other purposes that they want. They have a mid and small, another pond, dam. That's much closer for them to get access to. Still has gravity water because it's higher up on the landscape. And then they have that bottom large store of water, which obviously if they ever need it, it's there, but it doesn't have that same kinetic potential in the sense that it is low and they need to use a pump to get the water out. Now, most of us don't have a property of this size, but it's nice to show you that because you can take a look at this still from your property and go, there's my roof, there's my downspouts, there's where the water leaves my property, and there's where the edges of my property are. And if you can understand where it's coming from and going to, you now are able to start putting intelligently elements in to optimize that water before it leaves. A good example of this would be rain tanks. So this is an example of a rain tank system using IBCs, International Bulk Containers. You can find them on Kijiji, although I bet they're a hot commodity going right now. Often I found them before on there for $40 each, but you're more likely to see them at around $100 each. Way cheaper for 1,000 liters than your typical rain tank that you could buy from a hardware store, for example, or a landscaping outlet. You can raise that, you can paint it black and it gets now hotter. If you want warm water and you don't want algae growing inside, you can put things on, all these sorts of additions on it. And there's tons of solutions out there on how to DIY your own rain tank system. But the point I'm trying to make here is that they know where the water's coming from, it's their roof, and they're storing it so that they can then use it later. Simple, but sometimes that's all we need is just a simple way to store our water and then use it when we need it. All right, so that's sectors. You understand the big three now? If you understand those three and you start looking at your landscape for those three, you can start putting in all sorts of solutions. And I'm going to get into a few more of those techniques, specific techniques, which utilize and work with these three. The second thing I want to emphasize is working around humans, zones, not having wasted human energy. The quickest way to explain this is oftenest, nearest. That which you need to interact with the most frequently should be close. If it's not, you are wasting your human energy. Imagine going back to that example of the kitchen. If your sink was upstairs, your oven was in the basement, and your fridge was on the main floor, you wouldn't have a lot of fun cooking. I can guarantee it. And when we start looking at our yards and engaging them, many people are exhausted because they're often putting in things that don't serve much function and require constant input. But then the relative location of them. A great example of this is a compost. We usually take that compost pile and we put it at the back end of the property. And there's many reasons I know people do that, but they're all wrong reasons. It should not smell and it should be managed right. And you need to go to it often, at least twice a week, if you've got a little thing on your counter for getting your kitchen compost. So that's a lot of human energy to walk to one end of the property or not. And most people's compost piles fail or are ill managed because they did not honor their human energy that it takes and they put it farthest away. We divide zones into 5 groups. Let's see if I can actually zoom in on this picture. There we go. So in this one, you can see the 5 separations. Now your property won't look quite like concentric rings like this, but at the end of the day, we will break it into 5, where 1 is the things we interact with all the time. This is our intensive gardening efforts. This could be chickens if you're checking on the eggs for every day. Zone 2, you're getting a little further away. You still need to check up on them. Could be bees, depending on your bee system. Could be a multi-graft fruit tree. Could be still more gardening, but areas that and plants that don't need as much care and attention. Zone 3, you're going to even less frequently now. In a larger landscape, maybe you'll have an orchard here or a main crop. Zone 4 in a larger landscape could be a woodlot, mushroom inoculation, foraging, could be a place for pasture. And then Zone 5 is an area we say we leave as it is. It's nature. It's where we go for relaxation, inspiration, and possible recreation. There's no hard rules on the distances from your house. It'll look completely different from one house to another. So this is an example of it applied at a more urban lot. You can see the green zone is zone 1. That is the area they're going to go to all the time. It's off their back porch. It's looking out the back door. It's where they're going to go and rest, relax. And it could be right off that deck that they're growing a lot of their food. Zone 2 is the front yard, that they're still going to have some effort and care out there. And maybe they're actually still going to grow some food out there too. But they're not going to go into it as much. And this is true for most people. Their front yards are more open, I guess you could say, and open to the public. And they prefer to have that privacy of their backyard. Zone 3 off to the side of the house, you can see less frequently used. And then they have 2 zone 4s instead of a zone 5 with different things allocated to each. Now you can apply this very easily to your own property. And anytime you go to put in something, say a garden bed, say a rain tank, say you're going to get chickens, say you're going to put in that compost pile. If you have this general idea of how you plan to use your property intelligently for your human effort, you will not make the mistake of putting the wrong thing in the wrong area. It applies to larger landscapes as well. That tiny little green square you see close to the middle of this image is zone 1, that's a house. So you see this is a fairly large property. Zone 3 for them, the yellow area, is their crop. So these are farmers. So they are using that landscape, and that's where they're doing intensive grazing and silvopasture. They have that zone 5 area now in this one, a back end of the property, and they have a river valley or a creek going through their property. So that area is going to be left as it is. They should not disturb that and upset the waterway. And I think it's also interesting to note that they have that zone 4. For those of us who live out in the countryside, if we start looking at ways to provide our own heat instead of using natural gas, one way you can do that is through having wood. And yes, we can buy wood, and yes, people are chopping down trees all the time, and sometimes we can get that for free. But there is an art to managing what is called the woodlot. And it is not a lost art. But for those of us who have the space, it is something worth reinvesting in, to having a space that we are going to manage and go in and thin strategically and create an ecosystem that's healthy, that is constantly producing wood, the same way we would expect a healthy garden to produce food. Often we approach it as a clear-cut way, and we come in and we cut too much, or we act on necessity and we just take the wood. But we can actually create systems of sustainable wood. So there you go. There's a little bit about a few different things on techniques, and also with applying zones and having efficiency in the areas we engage with on our property. Now let's get to more of the magic around connections between elements. This is where a lot of people get excited, but I need to emphasize something before I move forward. You have to have 1 and 2 done well for 3 to work. If I, for example, do companion planting between my crops or my garden plants, and I put them together strategically, and I'm going to put my marigolds next to my tomatoes, and I'm going to have this type of corn, which is cold resilient, and I'm going to have peas climb up it. Well, that's fantastic. But if I don't put them in the right spot relative to the larger flows of energy and my human energy, that's where those systems fail. And I think this is probably the missing thing from a lot of education around food, is we teach people about the specifics of food and what variety did you use, and what did you put in the soil, what kind of mix did you use, or how did you handle this bug? And we get really drilled into the specifics of something without seeing the bigger picture of our human energy and the climate and ecosystem we're living within. So now that I made that point, now let's talk about connectivity and actually placing those things together in intelligent ways. I also have to make this point before I show you too much of these. You only have the power of placement, not connectivity. What does that mean? That means when we go to put 2 things together, we can think it's ingenious all we want. But there's relative time variables often at play. For example, if you're going to do that one I mentioned earlier about getting a cold hardy variety of corn, you can do. If you don't plant it at the right time and you plant your peas next to it too early, your peas could pull that thing down or hinder its growth. But if you grow at the right time, that corn can grow up and your peas can use it like a trellis. And the trees will fix the nitrogen for that corn. And now you have 2 crops in the space most people would do 1. But you had to put the 2 in the right time relative to each other. You can't make them connect. To put it another way, it's like relationships. You can't just throw 2 people in the room and expect them to fall in love. It's got to be the right people at the right time. All right, now let's show you some examples of this applied, and you'll see what I'm talking about, and I'll hopefully inspire you with more than a few ideas, not just for how humans can exist within their ecosystems, but specific ideas for your property. Okay, the first one is not going to work so much for here, but it's still fundamental for us to acknowledge. And that is, people are not new to living on Earth. And many indigenous people around the world already had everything that I've been talking about figured out. We really actually need to honor some of the traditional wisdom out there about how to grow food, because people didn't have access to as much technology as they do now, and they had many, many more years to harmonize with their ecosystem. One example of this, and I'll go into a prairie example in a second for more of our Canadian ecosystem, but this example is in Asia, and it's a terraced hillside where they're doing rice. Now, yes, they got rice, they've got the water placement, they've thought about contour lines. By the way, those are contour lines, those are elevations. If water sits level behind, you know they're on contour. So we have water placed strategically well with earthworks. Then we have a plant placed to optimize and use those conditions that the earthworks created. And then strategically what they've done is they've used a species of duck. So what's critical about this is, again, that timing element that I mentioned earlier. they put the duck out into the rice paddock as the rice is starting to mature. And they put baby ducks. So the baby ducks are wandering through these rice that's just starting to grow up and just starting to have its grain appear. And the baby duck is unable to eat grains at this point. Its digestive system has not evolved to break down rice. Not yet. So what it does instead is it wanders through this rice paddock, eating all the insects and turning what would be called a pest into a solution. There's no problems, only solutions. There you go. That's I think a very interesting one in terms of placing an animal with a plant within a landscape that honors the water and the sun. You see how I'm starting to pull this together. If you wanted to take a similar example to this that you could do in your own urban, not so much urban, but definitely rural. I actually know a farmer just outside Edmonton who does something similar to this, is you could have apple trees and you grade your apples in the field. Rather than pick them all and throw some away later, you can have pigs in the understory, and tree apples that fall become pig food. And you, by the way, you short circuit a bunch of the apple fly maggot and other pests as well this way, because they don't have rotting fruit to lay their eggs in. So now you have it being a resource, and you have an integration of us as humans with this fruit-bearing tree with an animal, and that's a little more relevant for our climate. If you want to read more about this, this is actually a highly recommended reading in the Permaculture Manual. It's a great book called One Straw Revolution. The author is Fukuoka. For something a little more relevant and close to home, this is called rotational grazing or holistic management. It has different names. But what it is it's basically honoring that the prairies usually want to become a forest. And what keeps them prairie is constant energy input in keeping them down. And that used to be in the form of a large biological lawnmower called the bison. And when we start looking at rearing cattle, they do a similar thing as bison would. They would want to be traveling as a herd. They would be always moving to greener pastures. They would never be standing in their own shit and eating the nubbins of grass. And yet we often make our fields this way. Our feedlots and our pastures, we will keep cows in an area too long so that they are standing in their own manure and they are trying to eat just a tiny amount of grass. It's trying to come back. And we don't encourage a healthy ecosystem. In this example picture that you see up here, you see dividers of fences. And the cattle are actually controlled at which pie shape they're allowed to go into. And you can see the effect. Some of those areas are more green and they're more healthy. And they're going to let the cows into those areas and close them off and allow the other ones to heal back, to encourage a natural ecosystem again. Again, work with nature. Copy what she does. How did this animal want to move through its ecosystem and interact with it? In this manner. Here you can see they're ready. That's a thin little wire. You can actually get rotational grazing electric fencing and put a small voltage through, just enough to make the cow twitch and it won't touch it ever again. I help manage and use a system like this in Australia. Fantastic and amazing system to control where your animals go on your property and how they eat, and you end up with a much healthier ecosystem. Now, if we ended it there, we would have still more. We could still. Oh man, look at the time. I better rush. We're running out of time, guys. So what we're going to do is we're going to put chickens with us. And so, and you see in this system, the chickens are actually going to be pulled into each area the cows were previously, and they're going to scratch apart the cow patties, eat the maggots inside, and they have now their own feed. So now we have cattle, grass, humans, and chickens all integrated together. For something for your own backyard, you could look up a chicken tractor, which utilizes a chicken to do your fertilization, aeration, de-seeding, debugging of your soil. You can have an open thing where, like this, where the chickens can scratch at the ground, and then you move it along after they have sufficiently fertilized and de-seeded, de-weeded, and scratched the soil for you. A quick one for you for a tip for your property is to use worms. So worms are a fantastic hard worker. I don't know why we are all insistent on making compost piles when we can make compost in the ground and often in our own gardens. Yes, rodents will try to get to it, but there's ways to help prevent that. You can always, when you say dig a hole and put your compost in it, put paper on top. It acts like a carbon filter. What you'll end up doing is encouraging all these pockets of worms around your property, and you will be inoculating your worms or your property with worms the same way when we have probiotic yogurt. It inoculates our gut with microbes. You can even do this with a compost tube in your garden. So in your garden, you can put this tube into the ground, drill holes into it first, drop your compost into it. Worms can get in, mice cannot, and just make sure you have the top covered. When it's full, you can let it sit and decompose further, then pull the tube out and move it to a new location. I'm going to run over this, but it's just more ideas around using water strategically. Now, I want to end with, in terms of a last pairing of techniques, just a reiteration of what I said earlier about trees, because trees can serve many functions. And indeed, I'm all about, I love perennial food. The idea that you plant it once and it keeps producing year after year. But placing those on everything else on your property to have a relative function to something else. In this example, you've got those coniferous trees that I mentioned, not just blocking the cold wind, but also helping block some of that western hot sun. Notice how those coniferous trees wrap around the west side of the house. And they have some southern trees, which help shade, particularly in the latter half of the day. But you can see the property is open towards the east and the southeast, when they would want maybe that coming in and hitting their house in the summer and in the fall and in the spring. Now, you'll notice they use deciduous trees, and if you think about that, the leaves drop. And so during the winter time, you have sunlight still coming through and hitting the house. Here is an example of a fairly well integrated property with a greenhouse, a body of water, tons of food in their front yard, and the relative placement of those trees, as I mentioned, to help shelter and block the sun from hitting the house on the southern side and on the western side. Point that I want to iterate, and I did this before I mentioned the connection, is always working from the larger patterns at play to the details. Always think about what kind of climate do I live within? What are those larger flows of energy? How do I optimize for my human energy? And then how do I put in the individual things that harmonize with the previous two? Whew, 3 minutes to go. Well, we might have to do a longer Q&A. I don't know if Sarah's going to let me, but we'll see. For those who are interested in learning more, there are 2 courses, as I mentioned. I do offer courses through my website, but this year I'm offering a good deal of these courses through NAIT. So super excited for that. The Sustainable Home and Property course begins this May 21st. I'm super excited to be offering that in this filming studio that I've created. It'll be on Thursdays for 5 weeks, for a total of 35 hours of instruction. For those who want to do an in-person training, that is going to be offered at NAIT as well, September 14th to 18th, a solid week, also 35 hours of instruction and time. You'll have a little bit more hands-on and a little more connection with me and my fellow teacher, Curtis. For those who are interested in learning a little bit more about tiny homes, I'm not going to go into it, but you can just check out my new website I just made called thetinyhouseworkshop.com. This filming studio will also be utilized for making an online version of that course, but I teach the in-person course of that across North America. For those who want to hear more about all the opportunities, whether it's talks like these, I've done talks at the Home and Garden Show, work with various partners. I also do Blitz events, events where we have the public come, as I showed you with earlier in the presentation, these edible community projects. Those are free a days where we come together as a community and we get to do hands-on learning and we get to make something together, which I think is pretty inspiring. If you're interested in learning more about the courses that I offer and the events that I'm a part of and the events that you can jump into, I highly recommend you get on my newsletter. It's just at my website, which is my name, kentonzerbin.com. You'll see this website start to develop more in the next year. But right now you can see the old courses that were on there. And of course, there's the newsletter. Guys, thank you so much for your time. It has been 59 minutes on the nose. I am going to pass the floor back to Sarah now, and we're going to open it up for some Q&A for as long as you guys want, or as long as Sarah's going to let me.
Thank you very much, Kenton. That's awesome. I know Carrie and I were kind of chatting back and forth behind the scenes here, and we're both really interested in taking your course. So Well done. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us. We do have a couple questions, so if people do have to jump off, that's totally fine. We can make this stuff available after the fact, but there are a couple questions if you, I don't know if you can dive in and see the Q&A panel there, or I can
I
just
am
read
just
them to you.
opening it now. Yeah, I'm not sure how many there were.
Just a handful here. So somebody asked if there's funding or grant opportunities available for families who want to install sustainable systems and such on their properties. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Um, I am not. When you get out into the countryside and you're doing stuff relative to the economy, that changes the equation up. Unfortunately, those are always changing year to year, but there often is either related to environmental or economic. There's opportunities in that, and they just come from different places. I'm not too familiar with them in terms of that's almost like an area of specialty. You'll often have people will help you write those grants, and then they'll be paid to do so or take a portion of the grant. They can even build it into it. So that's there for those who are out in the rural properties. If you're going into organic and you're going to be helping preserve the environment, encourage biodiversity, or even add economically to your municipality and area, sometimes those exist even in terms of breaks or like, for example, I do know of one, and the reason I know of it is actually because of the tiny house movement in terms of people trying to get power to their tiny house out in the countryside. And one way you can get subsidized power is if you are proving that you are adding to the tax base of that area and you are actually running an operation for economic benefit. The municipality will put in power poles for you at a fraction of the cost. So that's one kind of example of it, but they're all over the map in terms of what you have to do to get it and who you get it from. So don't have anything overly specific for you.
Okay, we had another question. Somebody wanted to know when you're helping the NAIT community start our own food forest. And I echoed those sentiments. I'll help. So I don't know who we have to talk to about that, but you've got some eager NAIT folks.
Awesome. Yeah, no,
Um,
and I'd love to talk about that for a second because the whole vision of working with NAIT, also the vision isn't just to run one workshop. It's actually, so I have to give this to you. This is just a vision at this point. We're still in conversation. I'm talking with a few higher ups in NAIT, and also we have to look at where we would put a campus of sorts. But that facility that I helped build in Barbados was a permaculture research institute, and it becomes then a nationally recognized educational facility for demonstrating how to apply permaculture for a local area. And we would love to see that. And there's actually a property out in Sherwood Park that NAIT owns that we are in discussions with, talking about maybe potentially doing something like that out there. And we've also had discussions with staff at NAIT about using some of the staff, some of the property around NAIT main campus. But there's a whole bunch of red flags that come in there. So we can't promise anything at this point, but no, the discussions are being had.
okay, well, you've got an army of volunteers when that day comes, so that's good. All right. You did mention your website, but we had a question about social media.
Mm.
If people want to follow you, I did a little creeping, but
Yeah, it's just my name, Kenton Zerbin. I believe for some reason Kenton Zerbin was taken on Facebook, so very unique name. I'm not sure how that happened. So it's the Kenton Zerbin if you're doing the @ symbol on Facebook. But otherwise, it's just my name on Instagram. I don't use Twitter much, but I have a profile on there. My main one is I do use Facebook, and you can see numerous albums of projects on there and follow some of the stuff that I do.
excellent. So we've got a couple more questions in the chat area. Again, if folks need to jump off, that's fine, but we're going to try and get to them all. Someone wants to know if you're going to be offering more landscape design planning workshops.
Yeah, so this one coming up, the Sustainable Home and Property course, is a modification of that. So those who have followed my work in Edmonton area, I've done different variations of my courses. The first one was just basic skills like composting 101, food forestry 101, and design 101. And that one worked fairly well for that. Some people know they want some of those skills, but the integration of those skills is what's important. So for example, people don't always know they want composting. They don't know what composting is. So that's a hard thing to market. So I changed my workshops then to a different title. It was edible landscaping, design and plan, build and install, and plant and grow. And so those all had 3 different names, and they did fairly well and branched in that way. But all that I've done now with NAIT is I've taken those previous workshops and I've bundled it just a different way. So the landscape design side, you're going to learn in this course starting May 21st. I have to teach it, that top-down mapping, because you're going to make your own project plan for your property in that course. So I'll teach you top-down mapping, teach you how to start understanding that surveying and where's water coming and going, and you're going to be kind of step through kind of a project implementation of your own property. So that landscape and edible landscaping design course has been rolled into the sustainable home and property course.
Okay, so Carrie and I are definitely going to sign up for that. Another question here, any recommendations or preferred vendors for garden soil in Edmonton?
Ah, you know, at the end of the day, all the professionals who you're getting it from, they have to have some accountability at what they're getting. And yet at the same time, the accountability ends at certification. So if you want certified organic soil, that's pretty hard to come by, but it's there. It's often in a bag. So that's not great for environmental footprint and plastic and all the rest. Nonetheless, the bigger companies who are making it and screening it, they aren't just taking, for example, steroid-loaded horse manure and composting it and then selling you something that's not safe. They do have certain certifications they have to prove, and I'm not sure what the exact process is of each one. I haven't heard any horror stories yet, but it could happen out there. But again, that falls back to the larger companies. So if, say Burnco did something, not well, and that goes to their social media, that hinders them, right? So most companies are selling you mediocre or just, normal enough compost. The best way though is just always make your own, and it's not hard. There's numerous ways you can do that, whether it's a vermicomposting bin inside, now you have enough for starting your seedlings and using around to supplement your site, or whether you're doing it on the large scale and you're doing it in cubic meters in your backyard. You can make your own compost bay out of pallets, free material, if you so wish. And you can be making it in the cubic meters, taking other people's scraps, grass clippings, leaves, and in the course of a couple months to a year, you could be getting your own finished compost for free.
Awesome. And it looks like we've got one more. Oh, wait, maybe a couple more. Question about the zoning laws around chickens, etc., in Strathcona and Sturgeon County, and tiny house zoning laws. That's
Wow, they
that's a
want to go into
that's a
all the
short
details.
topic, right?
No, yeah, it's just easy. The answer is no. No, just kidding. The so let's start with tiny homes. So zoning around tiny homes is complicated. It does come back to building code, and knowing what the rules are for your local area. So what I often advocate to people is, if you're going for a tiny house, make sure you have some sort of code that you're building it to, because as soon as you do that, you have your zoning follow-up that goes with it. So for example, if you build it to RV standards and it is certified as such, you're now allowed to put it everywhere you're allowed an RV. And you have to follow those rules or live on the gray side of the law, but suffer the repercussions if you are caught, which I can't advocate legally. The other side of that is, okay, so that's RV, but then you could also go, for example, a manufactured home, and that has a whole new zoning rule implications and where you're allowed to put them. Often you're not allowed to put manufactured homes in most cities or urban areas. Edmonton is quite lenient on that with the use of garden suites now and alleyway housing. And garage suites. You can actually use manufactured homes for making a secondary dwelling. But as far as I know to date, Edmonton has been progressive in that, and the following areas around it are not quite in the same point. But Edmonton has blazed the way, so it's fairly easy for now it being used as precedent. That same kind of line of reasoning applies with animal systems. So most places that are interested in having chickens and bees, for example, will do a pilot project first, and then it'll go from there. Um, I'm not certain at what the exact is. I think you said Sherwood Park in Sturgeon County, or what was the two? Go and find and see if I can find it.
Sorry, yeah, that was Strathcona and Sturgeon.
Yeah, Strathcona and Sturgeon. Sturgeon, actually, I remember reading an article about them where they actually were being very lenient around it. I'd have to go find the exact reference to it, but they were saying something along the lines of it was basically a small backyard. So I think it was pigs, even chickens. Um, I don't think goats were on there, but you were allowed in Sturgeon County and don't hold me to it. The article I believe referenced Mornville as well as being part of it. Are allowed to have chickens and pigs and bees. They had opened the doors to that. But a lot of other places, you just have to literally Google it and look up the animal with it and pilot project if you want to use that as a keyword, and you'll find the relative information. A lot of them have opened up, as I said, pilot projects. So you're allowed in, but you're going to have to either do a course or training, and you have to do some paperwork and apply. And they could come and check on you to make sure you're doing as you say.
All right, and then we have two more questions, I think, and then we're good. How much land does one person need to sustain their own food necessary for a year in Alberta?
Oh man. Well, I mean, that one gets highly complicated in terms of how you do it. There are plenty of examples of people doing high intensive gardening systems, and off an area even as small as an acre, you can grow at a tremendous amount of food. And if you're canning, preserving, and doing animal husbandry in there too, in terms of small ones, you can create a tremendous amount of food. Whether that will be 100% of your food, that might be a bit challenging at that point. And this kind of goes back to, again, what I said about community. Um, you're unlikely that you're going to be, growing your own wheat and milling your own flour. But, I happen to know someone who does that. Gold Forest Grains is a farm just outside Edmonton that does that. And he's a good friend of mine. And that's where I get my flour. And of course, I'm not going to try to go through the whole gamut of making my own flour and growing it. But say, for example, if I turn my backyard into a berry oasis, maybe my farmer who's growing wheat is not very interested in managing cherries and Saskatoons and Haskaps and raspberries, but I love that. Well, there's an opportunity now for barter, and now we're talking, the relative space between his massive farm growing wheat and my small area growing berries. I don't need all those berries myself. So the question is a matter of how much do you really want to take on. I think we can prove that we can live on small spaces of intensively, but most of us do not have the knowledge, skills, time, energy to try to put ourselves through that gauntlet on our own. Makes much more sense to start small, go from there, and then operate with others to meet your needs.
Fantastic. And it looks like, I think Marina, we asking about tuition for the course, and that's information I don't have right at this second. I'm not sure if Kenton knows that, but it's definitely Canadian dollars. NAIT is a Canadian institution, so you don't have to worry about the exchange rate there.
Yeah.
But that information will be posted on the NAIT website. So if you do want to check back later, the course code for that, Marina, if you're still there, is SEGC 101 Permaculture. So all of the course data will be up hopefully pretty quick here. And so I think that's it. If there are any more questions, speak now or forever hold your peace, or go harass Kenton on social media.
What are you doing? Get off the computer. I want to be outside.
Exactly. It's so sunny. Everybody wants us to stop talking so they can go outside and enjoy the sunset. All right.
Well, thank you, everyone. I appreciate you making the time to be out here, and I wish you luck in hopefully getting applying some of what you learned today towards your property, or at least get the wheels churning. And hopefully, we'll see you at another event soon.
Fantastic. Thanks, Kevin or Kenton, and thank you, everyone. Have a good night.